Just a short introduction. So Professor Patrick Devine-Wright is an environmental social scientist, University of Exeter, with background in environmental physiology and human geography, specializes in researching significant policy relevant environmental problems using an interdisciplinary collaborative approach that is theoretically informed and has clear pathways to impact. He has focused on researching issues of social acceptance and community engagement with sustainable energy transitions, in particular with technology projects such as wind farms, high voltage power lines, and similar. Currently, he's the director of the Access project that aims to champion the application of environmental social sciences to address environmental problems, and part of the presentation, the last part, will be focusing also on that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. All right, let me just share my screen. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak. And it's a great honor to be speaking to you all today. I'm not actually in Exeter at the moment in England. I'm actually in in Switzerland in the mountains at a writing retreat on another project, but I hope through the wonders of technology that you can hear me successfully over the next hour or so. And I have some slides to show, as you might expect, which I hope will be of interest. And I look forward to any questions that you might have about the content of the slides in due course. But as you can see already from the description and the title, what I'm going to try and do today is to frame approaches to energy transitions that can be seen in a kind of a positive light. And I guess this is because my own perspective as a social scientist is to be critical where appropriate, but also to recognize that in a climate and environment emergency, we need social science to make useful, good ideas available to society and to decision makers and to policymakers. And for me, at least, two of those key ideas, not the only ones, but two of those key ones might be ideas about place and ideas about participation. And I'm going to describe those in a bit more detail. And of course, those of you who are interested in concepts of environmental justice, energy justice, etc., will see the connection with participation at least. But at least I hope that the connections between justice and place might come out of this talk as well and prove useful for the discussions we might have and the thinking we might have going forward through this event and beyond. So, excuse me, just. Okay, so just to make a very brief introduction, well, you've already heard about my disciplinary background in environmental psychology and human geography. And I guess I do a particular kind of environmental social science. I work on energy transitions, mainly under the overall umbrella of climate change mitigation. I'm open to useful insights from whichever discipline they come from. In that sense, I'm quite undisciplined. For me, it's just whether it's a good idea rather than whether it's a good geography idea or a good sociology idea. I'm less bothered about that. And increasingly in my career, I have valued working collaboratively with stakeholders to ensure that the research isn't just important from an academic or theoretical point of view, but it has some broader application in society, given the sense of urgency that I personally feel and many in society feel about the emergency that we're living within. I tend to take an empirical approach using multiple and mixed methods. So I'm neither a purely quantitative or purely qualitative researcher, and I also really value fieldwork in case study contexts because I'm interested in place, and place then often translates into doing case studies in particular real world contexts. And as Rob mentioned, and I'll touch on at the end of my talk, I've just begun a big new project in the UK called Access, which is about trying to show a positive vision for the contribution that social science can bring to the solving of environmental problems. And I'll say a bit more about that towards the end. And as you can see from the right, I guess one of the evolving distinctions of the way I've been working is across geographical scales. So, I mean, obviously working for the IPCC or whatever, it has a nice reputation. It's good to be working at an international level. But ethically and fundamentally, I also believe that it's important for social scientists to work in our own backyards with our own local municipalities and neighborhood groups and organizations. And so that's very much part of my own personal story. About 5 or 6 years ago, I joined a local community energy group as a director. I was hoping that I would be able to inform them about my learnings and it would have some practical application. I actually found that I learned a lot more out of that than I probably contributed, and maybe we can discuss that too. But getting involved in the practice of energy transitions, not just the academic research, is, I think, very important and useful learning for us. So I guess I'd like to begin by going back to the start. And when I began researching these issues around energy transition in the early 2000s, approximately 20 years ago, at that time, particularly in relation to the siting of controversial energy infrastructures, the most common framing of the problem was in terms of NIMBYism and the NIMBY concept, which means not in my backyard. And it didn't take very long to encounter the work of other researchers like Martin Wolsink from the Netherlands, who are very critical of these common framings of the public as NIMBYs. And so from quite an early stage, the agendas of the social scientists involved were to be critical of common imaginaries of framings and to try and come up with alternative framings or theoretical approaches that were grounded in this broader social science knowledge that we can bring to bear. And people like Kate Birmingham at the University of Surrey, from a sociology background, were quite clear that researchers shouldn't be perpetuating the NIMBY concept, but instead we should see it as an object of study. So who is calling people NIMBYs? Why are they doing that? What function is it serving? These are the kinds of things that energy social science can be looking into. And arising from those concerns about the problematic framings of objectors in particular, came ideas about, say, social acceptance 15 years ago as a more useful framing, even if it's problematic in some ways, but a more useful framing than NIMBYism to understand objections to the siting of energy infrastructure projects. And in my own personal work, I've spent a lot of time talking about place and place attachment, which I'll describe, and also looking into participation and how those two can be brought together. So let's just talk about this concept of place and a place-based approach, and I'll try and summarize this in a neat way through examples of research that I've been doing in the last couple of years. So really, I think you can boil this down to 3 distinct pillars. The first is ontology, which is what we understand reality to be. What does place say about that? And then there's the concept of place attachment, which is about the feelings and connections we have with particular places in the world. And thirdly, there's this idea of place in terms of making places, unmaking, remaking places, transforming places, that I think has particular usefulness as a concept to understand energy infrastructure siting and energy transitions. And I've got a paper which is literally just coming out very soon in ERSS, Energy Research and Social Science, that defines these in a little bit more detail. So I can refer you to that afterwards. So I'm going to go into these 3 pillars, one in turn, one by one. So in terms of ontology, I mean, taking it back to its root, energy geography in particular would start with a fundamental proposition that the context or the place in which energy projects take place, it is more than just a container or a kind of a background, like a theater, a set of a theater, and the actors wander around, and then we've got the backdrop, and it's just kind of in the background. Instead, people like Tim Cresswell, geographers, have said that the spatial context is itself a fundamental part of our lived reality. And so if we see the world as a world of places, it has big implications for how we do research and what kind of theoretical understandings we bring to bear. So when we bring this place-based approach to energy transitions, it provides an ontological foundation which conceptualizes technology deployment as an act of place-making. So it isn't just seen as a kind of a technology that's abstracted from a landscape or a town or a village or a mountainside, but in some senses the context, the spatial geographical context, is as much a part of that the process of energy transition as a given technology like a wind farm or a high voltage power line or a gas project, whatever it is. So then we understand energy projects as assemblages where aspects of technology and place come together in often unique ways and unfold over time. So the place-based approach emphasizes the locatedness of energy projects, and in doing so implicates the lived experiences of local residents, the emotional attachments that they feel to those local places and landscapes, and the sense of identity that they have, which is connected to people, to being people who live there, maybe over time, even over generations. So what do we mean by place? Well, it's not an easy thing to define, but it's a complex assemblage of multiple dimensions and aspects, which are at one and the same time social, psychological, environmental, material, political, economic, etc. And it's all of these brought together in a multidimensional way, unfolding over time, is what we mean by a place. And the important thing to recognize is that places exist before energy projects happen, and they're also then implicated by and affected by the deployment of particular technologies. So we have to understand that the history of place relations, the history of what happened before, is important in understanding how energy projects take place. So we have to take that into account. It isn't just about looking at a project and thinking, is this a good place for a wind farm or a good place for a solar farm? What does that mean? So place attachment is something different again, and it's about feelings. It's about how people feel about the places that will be transformed by energy infrastructure siting. And place attachments are the emotional bonds that develop over time from the lived experiences of people in their socio-physical environment. And that's a long-standing definition from 30 years ago. So in trying to critique the NIMBY concept and find alternative explanations that are theoretically grounded, what I was proposing was that if we want to have a different way of understanding objections, then maybe we can draw on ideas like place attachment and then interpret that when objections take place, it might be because people anticipate changes to place that are perceived to threaten the attachments and identities that they have, the character of the places that they feel connected and emotionally attached to. And this explanation for community responses has been applied in many different empirical research contexts over the last 20 years, across hydroelectric case studies, offshore wind, high voltage power lines. But the important thing to say is that across these different case studies, place attachment also provides a potential explanation for why communities support projects. It's not just about explaining NIMBY objections. And we've also found that when projects are interpreted by local people to be positive for a place or landscape, then there is a strong, significant positive relationship between how much they feel attached to a place and how much they support new kinds of infrastructure sightings, whether they're for tidal energy devices or even for new nuclear power plants, if they are sited in places which already have existing nuclear facilities and are considered to be in keeping with the character of that local place. So there's a number of learnings I think that you can have there around alternative ways of understanding why landscapes matter to people and why they might feel upset and might protest, but also support proposals for energy infrastructure siting. Now, what I want to do here is to go back to a study that one of my PhD students was involved in, Etienne Bailey, that was published in 2016. And the key kind of learning from this research is that, not, as you might expect, not everyone feels attached to the local area where they live. And even if they do feel attached, they might have different kinds of types or varieties of attachment. So Etienne came up with a typology of different ways of relating to place, which he found in his study to help explain different responses to a proposal to site a nearby high voltage power line. So I'm just going to take you through these different types of relationships with the local place. And the key thing which was novel about this research was that this came from a qualitative interview study with about 25 or 30 local residents. And in each case, the project, the research started by asking people, okay, where are you from? How long have you lived in this town? Which other places, if you have not always lived here, how many other places have you lived in the past? And what kind of places were they? So I'll go through the different types of what he called a people's residence history and their life trajectories in terms of residence places. And firstly, Etienne found that there were a group of people who had always lived in the local area, or they had been born there, they had their childhood there, they had moved away briefly, didn't particularly like what happened, and returned to the home place. These were people who felt very strongly attached to this place, and they were described in the literature as having a kind of a traditional variety of attachment. Now, because this particular location in southwest England, where a new power line proposed, because it had some smaller power lines already there for several decades, these kinds of people who lived locally regarded electricity infrastructure as familiar, and they tended to accept the proposals for change. By contrast, we found other types of people who were also very strongly attached to the local place, but who had lived there for a relatively short time frame, who had moved in more recently and had moved into this place because they saw it as a lovely, beautiful, natural environment. These people were also strongly attached, but they had very negative views of the proposals. They regarded them as industrializing the natural landscape, and they were very strongly against the proposal. There were other people who were existing in the research who had also moved into the town as adults, but they moved from very different kinds of places. So, for example, from a large city to this small rural town. And these people, to some degree, felt fairly equivocal about being there. They didn't regard themselves as very strongly attached. Some of them even felt a little bit kind of alienated from this rural town that they regarded as a bit boring and quiet. Nothing ever exciting really happened. And for these people, you know, the implications of the power line on the landscape or place, it wasn't really very relevant to them. But that didn't mean that they were happy about the proposals. They were also against it for different reasons, but for reasons of procedural injustice or distributional injustice. And we found a very small number of people who we regarded as exhibiting a kind of a placelessness. And this small group of people, when you looked into their past and their childhood, their parents had moved around an awful lot. So they had lived in many, many different places, often in many different countries, because their parents had had employment in different places, because they worked for the government or for the army or whatever. And so these people had never developed a sense of strong connection to place as being important for their sense of identity. And so again, the impact of the proposal for the power line on the local landscape wasn't particularly important, because the landscape wasn't particularly important for them. But they were still against the project, but for different reasons, not for place-related reasons, but for more justice-related, more normative-related reasons. So if you put all this together, what you understand then is that actually there are a whole variety of ways that people respond to power line proposals. We knew that already, but this contextualizes those varied responses in different kinds of residential place histories. So they help us to understand why there isn't any neat relationship between place attachment on one hand and whether people object to projects on the other. In fact, there's quite a complex storyline which varies from person to person, depending on their childhood and where they lived and how many places they've lived and how rooted they feel in the place that they are living. So I've talked a little about place as ontology. I've talked a little bit about place attachment. Now I want to talk about place making. And I think this is a very useful concept to understand the transformations that particularly big energy infrastructures bring to particular places and landscapes. And as I've mentioned already, what comes up again and again in different projects, not only in the UK, but in other places where I've done research, like in Norway, but particularly in rural countryside areas, is that their projects are perceived in a negative way because they're labeled as industrializing the landscape. They're destroying the character of beautiful natural places. And how we understood this, and this is work I did with a colleague, Susanna Battel, we understood this by taking a concept from social psychology called essentialization. And essentialization is a process of discourse which tends to simplify and rigidify the differences between category A and category B. So it can be used, for example, in research that's been used in example to gender, so we can essentialize what a man is and what a woman is. But we also see this playing out in this research in relation to energy infrastructure siting, and in particular to essentialize the idea of what the countryside is taken to symbolically mean. And in England in particular, there's a very strong idea about the countryside as a rural idyll. But it isn't just in England. I mean, in Switzerland, where I am at the moment, the hotel I'm currently sitting in is called the Hotel Idyll. So this idea of the countryside being this tranquil, perfect place where there's sheep and cows wandering around, and there's no pollution, there's no factories, there's no industrialization. It's a very important cultural discourse, which then is manifest in planning regulations, governance, but it's an important emotional idea and social discourse as well. But it lies behind often the very visceral responses of people when they hear about these new proposals, for example, for high voltage power lines. And here are some text excerpts from focus groups that we did in this project in Wales, where people talk about scarring the landscape, destroying the landscape. They talk about, and then this is often used in relation to discourse around tourism and visitors into areas. You know, these tourist visitors, they want to escape from cities, they want to escape from industry, they want to come to nature, acknowledging all of the problems with essentializing nature in this way. And interestingly, we also see this as ways in which people, they reconfigure the NIMBY idea, which is a very negative, pejorative label for objectors, into people who are custodians. So they reframe the NIMBY label as a positive. You know, yes, okay, we're NIMBYs, but that's because we're standing up for the countryside. We recognize the value of the natural environment, and we're not prepared to just lie down and let big companies come in and destroy this beautiful natural environment. So it allows people maybe some latitude to reframe the act of saying no in terms of defense of the countryside, protecting the place. So again, this is what happens when we see energy infrastructure projects as place-making or unmaking or remaking existing places and landscapes. And it isn't just about what you can see on the surface of a place, it's also about the underground. This has come through very strongly in a project I'm involved in for the last few years in the UK about shale gas and fracking. So the extraction of natural gas from underneath the ground. And what we found in talking to local residents is that their understandings of what happens under the surface of the land is very much rooted in their connections to place, their understandings of local history and culture. And this was really interesting in places where we did case study research where there had been a history of coal mining. So the underground was part of their understanding of what the place was. And it also comes to the issue of expertise. There are local people who've worked in coal mining. They have knowledge, local knowledge about what the local place is like. But what we found was that in the course of the shale gas projects, the shale gas companies had no real concerns or interest in the opinions of these, in extracting this local knowledge and respecting this local knowledge. So we found a kind of a recognition justice issue here, or a lack of recognition justice, in the sense that the established consultation process didn't have any room for respecting and bringing forward explicitly local knowledge, even though people had lots of concerns about seismicity and earth tremors, about subsidence, and about drilling through abandoned coal mines that people didn't have, or that they were worried that the shale gas company simply didn't have sufficient understanding of. So placemaking isn't just about above the ground or above the surface and the visual impact, it's also about below the surface and underneath the ground, and about whose knowledge is seen to be important. And that starts to build the connections between, for example, the connection between the sense of place and the participation and engagement that goes on, and the degree to which local place knowledge is recognized or not in planning procedures. The final example about sense of place and place attachment I wanted to bring up is about a new project that we just recently started in the UK, and it's about net zero. And net zero is the really big policy idea in the UK, at least at the moment, about decarbonizing already heavily industrialized locations. So these are not beautiful natural environments at all. These are places where there has been electricity generation, oil refinery, gas refineries, fertilizer factories and production plants. Big polluting industries exist in these parts of the UK. And the question is, how can they decarbonize rapidly and extensively? So the government is putting a lot of support into hydrogen and carbon capture and underground or undersea storage. These are enormous, complex, expensive technical facilities, and there are lots of concerns about whether they can be established at scale, but they also raise important issues about place. Now, the government is conceptualizing, and industry is imagining these places as industrial clusters. So what is an industrial cluster, and how can we imagine it in terms of concepts of place and landscape at the same time? They tend to be estuaries, coastlines, ports, sea areas. They tend to be illustrated using maps to communicate where they are and who's involved and who will benefit and who might be impacted by these projects. So it raises many questions, which I think we're going to look at over the next few years in the research about net zero sense of place, about whether place attachments can be taken into account successfully in the process of industrial decarbonization. And can we connect up these ideas about net zero, sense of place, and just transition at the same time? Can local voices and local knowledge be brought to bear in this process of industrial decarbonization? So that's something we're looking forward to researching over the next few years. So those are a number of ideas. I'll just share one final one with you. Again, this is another map. And this is considering the act of placemaking in terms of how companies decide where they do consultation and where they distribute community benefit packages or funds. So that's an increasingly common way of trying to promote social acceptance if you're a wind energy company or a high voltage power line company. And this is a map of a rural part of Ireland, the Irish countryside, and it comes from a project that I did, which was part funded by the Irish grid operator, which is called EirGrid. And the red line on this map describes where they were proposing to put a new line, a new 400 kV line, and they wanted to distribute a community fund, but they had to make decisions about where it should go. So they engaged in this process of map making and placemaking, which was trying to define the spatial boundaries of the impacted community. And so what we see in many different energy infrastructure projects, if it's a wind farm, for example, they often just draw a circle around it. In this case, they drew a kind of a sausage, which was 2 kilometers away or 1 kilometer away, based on assumptions of visual impact on the ground in this landscape. And so what we did in the course of this project was to look at the way in which the stakeholders negotiated and interpreted different local views about where the boundary should go, which would then determine whether you could or could not receive community benefit payments. So there's quite a lot at stake here, in a sense, about where the dotted line on the map goes. And we came up with a number of recommendations for the grid company about how they could do this in a just and legitimate way, using extensive consultation with local publics to map community boundaries and movements within and without of settlements, to try and ensure that if this process was going ahead, then at least it could be done in as a transparent and legitimate way and fair way as possible. But again, it gives you an idea of how energy projects and the distribution of community benefits can also be seen as an act of placemaking. The area of this map is described as the impacted place by the project, but it's not a given. It can't be defined by an engineering algorithm. The company tried to use their engineering expertise to decide this, but of course it's socially constructed. And so they quickly realized that it had to be a process of stakeholder engagement and negotiation. And that's what we tried to look at in the course of the project. So to summarize the place-related aspects of these energy transition issues around infrastructure siting, here are some key implications and take-home messages. Number one, consider the siting of large infrastructures as acts of placemaking. Don't just imagine them as hydrogen deployment or wind energy rollout, but also something that is inherently transforming, remaking, unmaking particular places or landscapes in the world. View the people who live there not just as the public or consumers or NIMBYs, but view them as place inhabitants, people who at least have the potential to have very strong emotional and identity bonds with that area that will be changed by these infrastructure projects. Avoid a kind of perspective on these projects that ignores the previous history of what has happened in those communities and landscapes, because that is relevant to understanding how residents and communities respond to new proposals that might transform places into the future. Find ways of respecting local knowledge, local expertise. If you have people who have lived in places for generations, whether they've been coal miners or farmers, they understand the climate, the topography, the landscape, they understand environmental changes over time. Draw on that expertise rather than presuming that it is not relevant or not important, or you don't need to know that expertise. And that has a huge implication for processes of participation and consultation. Design them to acknowledge diverse knowledges and diverse attachments and ways of relation to place, as I mentioned. And those two different types of strong attachment that I mentioned, the active attachment and the traditional attachment, they need different consultation methods. And that's often not picked up and appreciated by technology citing companies. But the other point is about, often energy infrastructure siting comes with narratives about global climate change. We need to solve climate change, so here's a wind farm. Or we need to deliver a national policy, so here's a power line. What about local narratives? What about local stories of transformation that are positive, that are grounded in the history and culture of the local community? This is often absent in the narratives and justifications of technology proposals. But if we can identify an alternative process where companies engage with local residents, they try and understand local place history and the distinctive culture, and then try and forge collectively positive narratives of local place transformation, then maybe we have some potential to create projects that are not only good for the planet, but they're good for the local character of places as well, and enable better and positive distinctiveness and connections. And as I mentioned around that map making and where does consultation happen, where do benefits get distributed, if you are going to engage in that as a geographical process that makes places through map making and do that in a collaborative way, do it transparently, do it iteratively, and acknowledge the negotiation that needs to take place, recognizing different local groups who need to feed into that process in a fair and transparent way. So the further I talk about place, I think the more I'm starting to open up these issues of participation, which is my second key principle that I want to go on and describe today and now. So what do we mean by participation? Well, it's about the way in which people are involved in the process of technology deployment. And I like this picture because so often we see visual images of wind farms or solar farms that have no people in them whatsoever. And that tells its own story about lack of public participation. This is an example of a community solar energy project in England, and it shows that all technology projects are people projects to some degree, but if we can find ways of developing energy infrastructures that also put communities at the center of that process through participation, then we can have several wins and several benefits at the same time, and maybe also maximize the possibilities for social acceptance. So let's start with some fundamental understandings from several decades of research about public engagement and community engagement. And the first thing I want to say, drawing on the sociology literature, concerns these ideas of imaginary publics. So preceding every energy project, there are these ideas about, well, what are the public like? What are objectors like? What are communities like? And for many decades now, we found these established ideas that circulate across industry networks and policy networks about, for example, the public as NIMBYs, who are irrational, they are ignorant, they are selfish, they are emotional. These ideas percolate and they are influential. We also have this very long-standing presumption that actually the public don't really understand energy technology projects. They're way too complicated for local people to understand. And in fact, people don't really care. They're not really interested. And you can immediately start to see how practices of engagement and consultation then can be influenced by these widespread beliefs and assumptions about publics, in the sense that, well, why ask people's opinion in any in-depth participatory way if you've already decided that they have nothing that they can contribute to you because they don't care or they don't know? So it does shape engagement practices, and that's why they are important. And so you have these long-standing problems with consultation that effectively it's a tick box exercise. It is tokenistic. It's not really genuine. It's not really done early enough. It's not really done deep enough or sufficiently well to be a really appropriate participatory process. You make the decision and then you ask a few people's opinions, but it really doesn't matter. And what I've tried to say in my research in the past is that if you design engagement mechanisms with NIMBYism in mind, then in a way you are creating the problem that you think you are solving. Because by limiting engagement, by making it late, by making it superficial or shallow, you are providing reasons for people to object in the first place. And you can make objections more likely rather than less likely. So you get a toxic, self-fulfilling prophecy, which doesn't do anyone any good in the long run. So participation is really important, but it has to be done properly, and it has to be more than window dressing or doublespeak. But of course, that's something we find again and again and again. So here I'm drawing on some recent research we've been doing, as I mentioned, about shale gas fracking in the UK. And when you actually do some case studies and you look at what companies actually do, you find that in many cases, it's very superficial. There isn't much depth. It's mainly one-way information provision. There's very limited consultation, which is some two-way communication. And there really isn't any kind of participatory empowerment at all. And so this is something that I regard as being kind of, I guess, in the abstract, it's a problem. But given that shale gas and fracking in the UK has been so controversial, it's even more problematic, because you might think that a very controversial technology that might be considered to be dangerous for the environment or damaging to communities, the companies would make even more of an effort than they might have done in order to engage, but we didn't find that. And what's even more problematic is that if you look at the official documentation submitted as part of the planning application, you have these claims being written into the planning applications that extensive consultation has been undertaken with the community. So what on earth is going on here? You have a kind of a doublespeak where they're on the one hand doing very little engagement, predominantly one-way information provision, and on the other hand, there are these claims being made as part of planning applications that it's extensive and it's consultation. Well, I don't think that it is. I don't think it really justifies those kinds of claims. And here's an example of some of the problematic bases of that kind of company-led consultation. So again, I'm quite interested as someone in a geography department in the way maps are used as artifacts to justify decision-making around community consultation. Here is a map from a developer document submitted in the planning application. And the yellow blob represents the area that the company decided was the impacted community. So it's different from the sausage I showed you earlier around the high voltage. Now it's a nice, neat, spatial circle diagram, and it simply reflects how the developer went 1.5 kilometers from the fracking drill site, drew a circle and said, okay, that's my community. There was nothing more extensive or complex than that involved. But what was really problematic in this case study was that if you look at the map on the left, the green line is a major road And just to the right-hand side of it is the institutional boundary between one municipality and another. The right-hand side was the municipality where the planning, decision-making was going on for the shale gas project. The left-hand side of that institutional boundary was a town of 20,000 people that was only approximately 2 kilometers away from the drill site of this proposed fracking project. But because it was on the other side of the boundary, there was no formal consultation in this location at all. There were no public meetings held there by the company. There was no attempt to distribute newsletters or to engage with local people in any extensive way. And this is highly problematic because the people in this town felt directly impacted, and they also felt directly left out of the consultation process. So from a strictly legal perspective, the developer was doing the right thing, but from a kind of a social science, public engagement, or even a lived experience point of view, it was highly problematic, highly deficient, and was not appropriate as a way to do community engagement at all. And in the other case study that we looked at as part of this project, there were other things that came out as being highly problematic. So in this small village called Woodsets, the first that people heard about the project was when the company had a legal injunction preventing protesters from preventing access to the site. So they were expecting NIMBY protesters, and they were using legal devices, and that was the first way that the local residents heard that the project was going to happen. So what a start. Not very positive, you could say, in any way at all. Now, this developer, and in fact, both case studies, they said that they were going to do community liaison groups. So this is a kind of a forum where the developer and representatives of the community could come together and discuss impacts and benefits. But in neither case did the community liaison group ever happen in any substantive way. So it sounds like consultation, but it didn't happen in any effective manner. And you can see from the text extract below that it was regarded as a farce. It was regarded as a joke. There was no trust between the community and the developer. So the proposition to join a community liaison group was never taken seriously, and in fact was abandoned and never functioned. So we can see that without proper engagement, without the probability to build relationships of trust over time, these efforts at consultation or participation are not likely to be successful. And if the developers think that it doesn't matter and they don't actually need to do this, then they put in little effort, and you get problems with procedural justice, and you get problems with community acceptance of proposals. But thinking about it a bit more positively and trying to bring my talk to a close, I have been involved for many years as an interest in community energy. And community energy, it means many different things, but the initial proposition is that it's a way of doing energy infrastructure siting which takes participation into account. It ensures high levels of participation, but also benefit sharing to the people who live locally and are directly impacted. And this comes with assumptions about alternative economic business models, maybe through share issues and cooperatives, social enterprises. So it's different from that large-scale multinational utility wind farm proposition, and instead it can be more citizen-led, it can be more community-instigated, more bottom-up, and it can lead to different then outcomes in terms of procedural justice, distributional justice, recognition justice. It's not just about local residents, it can be about people living further away who are given the opportunity to purchase shares depending on how the structures unfold. And the interesting thing about this that's been picked up in the literature is it's not just about instrumentally getting a project done quickly, it's also about strengthening energy transitions more broadly and strengthening participation and democratic structures more broadly. So we see these much larger co-benefits. So it's not just about getting project A done as quickly as possible, it's about thinking about broader energy transitions and the role of publics in a deep and genuine way in making them happen in a substantial way. But community energy is not some kind of rosy tinted that will inevitably be fair. The literature has shown very clearly that if you just let community energy happen, then it's most likely to take place in communities which already is able to mobilize resources and knowledge and expertise and wealth. So if you really want it to happen in society, you have to enable every community to participate rather than the ones that have the existing resources, and to enable that through some kind of supportive mechanism and framework. And you also need to properly evaluate the claims. Just like energy, like any energy project, you must think carefully about what is the outcome of a community energy initiative, and do they really always realize their goals. And the final example I wanted to very briefly give is interesting because it's not specific about energy transitions, it's more about climate mitigation more generally. And it's something that we took part in Devon recently by holding a citizens' climate assembly. We provided some expertise to the local authority about how to do this. And it represents a way of enabling public participation upstream in policy making through representative publics, mini publics, and the opportunity to listen to experts, to question experts, and then to inform policy which can increase that policy's legitimacy and quality. So this has been done increasingly in places around the world, at a national level, at a local level, and I think is a significant step forward. It is not easy, it's not necessarily quick, it's not necessarily cheap, but it is an important part of that jigsaw that we're trying to build of energy transitions that are fair and effective across society. So to come to a conclusion, as I said, I think place and participation represent positive principles for just and acceptable energy transitions. They help us to get over these negative, pejorative ways of thinking about the public as people with deficits, vocal minorities who are hijacking processes, NIMBYs, etc. We can get rid of all of those and have different and more positive ways of imagining public involvement in energy transitions. But it also means that we have to put place at the center of infrastructure siting. So these are acts of placemaking or unmaking or remaking. And we see members of the public not just as NIMBYs or consumers, but as local residents with diverse histories and attachments. But they have emotional connections that need to be respected and knowledges that can be brought into projects with the appropriate methods of engagement used by companies. We can promote community benefit provision, not just as an instrumental way to capture people's acceptance, but to promote distributed justice. We can promote community-led projects, not just big projects led by multinational companies, but we need to ensure that every community has the opportunity to do that. And finally, I think upstream deliberative methods have a very important role to play in creating the policy structures which can then have legitimacy across society to do energy transitions in a way that's consistent with a just transition as well. So that's that. And then I just want to very briefly finish by providing a very brief glimpse of this new project I'm involved in called Access. And Access is about mobilizing social science expertise to have an impact on decision-making and policy-making. So, and it's really come from this sense of we don't have any time to waste. It's nice producing more journal papers, but if the journal papers are not read by anybody in society, they don't really have an impact on decision making, and that's problematic. So how do we bring that knowledge to bear more effectively? So a conventional research project, as I'm sure many of you are already very aware, it tackles a particular knowledge gap. It aims to produce some kind of scientific breakthrough, and success is typically judged by how many journal papers you produce and how many conferences you present to. That's the mark of success. So you produce lots and lots and lots of journal papers, and maybe you do a few other things. You build the capacity of early career researchers, you produce some policy briefings. But when you produce these things, what impact do they have? And do you trace that impact as part of the project itself? Often you don't. Often you're just judged on the deliverables, but not the outcome of the production of those deliverables. And that's where Access is different. So Access is much less conventional in that sense, and it's based on these two key propositions. One is that if we have to achieve net zero by 2050, as well as other sustainability goals, then there will need to be large-scale institutional, community, and individual behavioral change. Social change is written into rapid societal transformation to reach net zero. So how do we do that? And it's based on the presumption that we can't only do that through mobilizing, say, natural science or through mobilizing engineering and technology. We need the understanding of those social change processes. And that's what the social sciences can bring, but it needs to be accessible, it needs to be agile, and it needs to be visible. And how do we do that? We do that through co-producing evidence with policymakers to bring about those changes which can lead to that transformation. So this is a 5-year project that's just started, funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. The objectives are to champion and lead environmental social science, paying attention to sustainability, principles of co-production and equality, diversity and inclusion, to develop a new network of interdisciplinary social science, to empower and train early career researchers to be able to work in interdisciplinary contexts, not just to be good sociologists or political scientists or political ecologists, but people who can talk to engineers or who can talk to policymakers and try and forge actionable insights, to have those skills in knowledge and evidence co-production, which people are not necessarily taught through undergraduate training or even often postgraduate PhD training. And to learn from our attempts to co-produce social science knowledge by producing new tools, new frameworks, and then to share them widely as possible to enable environmental social science to have more impact, more visibility, and a legacy over time. I won't spend too much time describing this. I can share these slides and it's on the internet anyway, but there are a variety of tasks to do with training, to do with horizon scanning, to do with rapid response, task forces, and engaging with policymakers over time, learning from the past, doing training. And if you want to know who's involved in this project, well, there are some institutions and names here. There's a leadership team made up of people who are not just from academia, but who are from policy stakeholder organizations as well, working together to try and mobilize effectively social science and bring it to bear in a timely and accessible manner. So yeah, I think I've probably spoken more than enough. It's about an hour gone, but I'd be very interested in any comments that you might have. And I hope you found at least some of that of interest. And if you do want to know more about any of these things, there is a website here for the project and the slides will be made available, I'm sure, and you can trace some of those publications arising. So thank you very much indeed. I can't really see anybody, but I hope there's somebody there anyway.
It's roughly about 100 people here. So
wow, brilliant.
90. Okay, probably.
Just me alone in this room here, it's very strange, but I'm glad to see that there's somebody there at least.
Yeah, so the room is quite full, plus we have 50 participants on Zoom. And yeah, are there any questions? We have a lot of questions. We'll start in the first row.
Thank you for the lecture. I would argue when it comes to stopping or at least resisting extractivist, destructive infrastructure projects, participation goes far beyond just the local population. So I was wondering whether you would agree with that and what kind of impact that has on place attachment of local population, how much kind of alliance forging is possible within these kind of activist resistances.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, firstly, let me say that I guess I probably emphasize quite a lot the attachments of local people to local landscapes and places. But we know from the place attachment literature that you can be attached and you can care about a landscape that's very far away from where you currently live, and you can still feel a bond or attachment to that. So for example, there's some very nice research done in the place attachment literature about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, making it quite clear that visitors to the Great Barrier Reef who come from Europe or North America, they similarly feel an ethic of care to that place, even though they don't live right beside it in, Northeast Australia. So in some senses, physical proximity is actually not very useful when we think about the connections between people and particular landscapes. So I don't think, yes, I certainly don't want to say that the only people that matter in infrastructure siting are local residents. But on the other hand, I would say that local people are very important when it comes to infrastructure siting. And not just the people who tend to go to consultation events, but everybody who lives in a local area. Although I recognize that it's problematic to define the community boundary a lot of the time. So yes, I mean, I think when I think about participation, I don't just think about going to public meetings. I also think about collective actions and protest. That's why I have been for so long against the NIMBY assumption that we need to pejoratively imagine people who say no. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying no to energy projects that are poorly designed, poorly put in place, that are of the wrong kind, or there is poor procedural or distributional justice. I think it is actually highly appropriate to complain and to say no to those projects. But I also think that if you speak to local residents, you quickly get into situations where there are some quite interesting discussions to be had about how they feel about communities of interest rather than communities of place who come into local areas and engage in protest activity. So there are interesting dynamics to understand there in terms of energy social science and environmental social science, in terms of whose opinions are brought to bear and how the opinions of communities of location, communities of place and communities of interest interact with each other and influence decision-making and companies' engagement more broadly. So I think that's part of the complexity of the situations that we try and research and understand. But I very much would agree that the people who are from further away and people who choose to come and engage and protest, they have just as valid opinions to be listened to as people who might be considered to be local residents. And they can be impacted in different ways. And for me, a fair process would listen to all voices who wish to make their voices heard and to promote people and recognize the inputs of people who come from different places and not ignore people just because they don't happen to have a local address. I think that's very important. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We have a next one.
Thank you very much. My name is Daria Lazareva. I'm from EcoAction, and I really share your the points which you underlined in your presentation. And my question is to the second part of it. For me, as an activist, it's obvious that we need to involve local communities into decision making. But what about the perspective of business? It's quite often that the only or the main value for them is money. So how can we communicate to them, to businesses, to involve local communities? What benefits for them? I mean, to addition to that, they will face more support from local communities. So what values and benefits to business to involve people?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think firstly, it is perfectly appropriate to be critical of the practices of businesses who do not engage in genuine consultation or engagement with people who are impacted by a project of any kind. So we need that critical criticism to be brought to bear because it's genuine and valid and appropriate. But I think that there are quite sound instrumental arguments that you can bring to bear to companies to say that, for example, if they do not get engagement right, if they don't do participation in an appropriate way, at the end of the day, they suffer themselves. And the example that I would bring to bear here is that grid company in Ireland that I mentioned called EirGrid. So just over 10 years ago, they tried and failed to build a quite long high voltage power line which spanned the north of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the south of Ireland. The project was a complete disaster because they tried to do it quickly and they tried to ignore local people's views, and the project never got built. And in fact, they're still thinking about building it, but they were really scarred by that failed project. And the learning that they had, which we've been trying to support, I suppose, in the National Advisory Committee of that company is that there is a false assumption about trying to get technology projects done quickly. That if you take shortcuts in engagement, that actually they are counterproductive. And so the fastest way to get your project built doesn't mean taking any shortcuts or doing shallow engagement or minimizing engagement opportunities, because actually that raises risks to you as an organization that your project will not get built, that you will lose the investment that you've made, that the risk will be too much. So I think you can mobilize arguments which are not only normative arguments, but quite instrumental arguments, which say that if you really think that you want to get this project done effectively and you want to limit the reputational risk to your company, then you need to take engagement more seriously. And you can also say that there's a reputational risk from looking like you value engagement, but not walking the walk, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And in the end, that reputational risk might in itself be what actually pivots them to do this in a more proper and effective way. If they can be then prevent the widespread criticism that they are hypocrites, or that they are saying one thing and doing another, that makes them look very bad, and they are concerned about their reputation in the media, etc. So I think that there are ways that you can use criticism and satire, and you can convince companies that it's in their interest actually to try and do this effectively for all kinds of reasons. And hopefully those arguments might work, and giving them positive examples of other companies that have gone down this route and have learned from that process of making mistakes. Maybe that's something that you can mobilize as well.
Okay, we have another one, and then we go for one Zoom question and then to Matthias.
Okay. My name is Felipe Corral. I research on energy transitions mainly in Latin America. And thank you very much for the lecture. I was very interested in this idea of and concept of space when comparing it with like more indigenous understandings of territory that are a kind of place, but in a metaphysical sense, much livelier, kind of even endowed with an agency. So that beginning as a first remark that when you talk about the places as this ontological foundation for all these other reflections, there are many understandings of place that are not only in the European or Western understanding of place that has an entirely different attachment. So that at first. But then the second remark that I wanted to make is that what you were describing, which I think is very applicable to the situation in Europe or in the UK and Ireland in your case, stands in tension with the larger kind of colonial reality that in many places occurs where there are very vertical hierarchies of knowledge and of citizenship, where some people are accepted as subjects of participation and engagement, and others are invisibilized, destroyed even, so as to hinder that participation, and not as a yeah, like from the very design of the project. So a little bit of the question I want to make is, how can we, looking at a more global dimension, how can we deal with these projects that from the very start are designed so that participation cannot occur, because if it did, and it were effective, allowing also, for example, people to refuse that a project is implemented, the project could not occur. So how can we as researchers point out that only if broader political economy arrangements that are based on exclusion, on people deliberately not being engaged, not being included in participation processes, that processes of transition are possible. how to open avenues in this global dimension for that more critical ways of thinking and reflecting on this topic.
Yeah, really good questions, actually. So the first one was about the idea of a place, and I guess emphasizing the fact that there are, and we've talked about this a little bit, you know, as I was suggesting from some of my case study research, the maps reflect a kind of a rationalist, a Descartesian objective view of space, which does not map onto the local lived experience reality of people on the ground. And you're absolutely right that once you open up the additional dimensions of indigenous cultures, then that becomes even more necessary to take into account, but also even more challenging and complex to represent those various different ways of understanding the local environment as a place or a country, but even more the necessity to do that, rather than to purely keep it in a kind of a domain of expertise, a kind of an engineering project, or you know, expertise from the company and not from local. So I think the idea of local knowledge, local expertise, opening up that pluralist epistemology perspective in energy infrastructure siting provides a potential route to open up the idea of what the place or landscape that is the context of an energy project, what it means, what it represents, and hopefully providing spaces for people to come forward and make that fully clear. And then to question whether the plans for technology siting are appropriate and are in keeping with the character of that place, however it's described. I don't think that's just something, by the way, that happens in, say, countries in the global south. As someone who's originally from Ireland, I'm aware of the ways in which folklore and historical ideas remain, but often buried below the surface, but also need to be taken into account once you take a place-based approach. But I absolutely agree that it is important. And that's why I was just saying that I think one of the key implications of the place-based approach is to respect and recognize and identify local knowledge, local expertise. And so if a participatory process is done effectively, then it is enabling local expertise and knowledges to be brought into the process, which I believe, maybe I'm naive or idealistic, but I think that can improve the process of technology siting. It might not lead to the project that you initially expected, but it might lead to a different kind of project, but it's still appropriate and valid for that location. Now, you brought up the challenging issue about hierarchies and exclusion, and I think it's a very important point to make. I think I would just would recommend that there are alternative discourses that you can bring to bear, which can be critical of those kind of exclusionary processes. One is sustainability, although obviously that can be problematic too. And the second one is just transition. So I think when we talk about low carbon energy projects or renewable energy projects, they can be narrowly framed as purely about emissions reduction, the deployment of technologies for emissions reduction, and the broader sustainability, the sustainable energy characteristics of those projects can be overlooked and ignored. So by bringing sustainability discourses to bear, is it a sustainable energy project? Are there social and economic aspects to this project, as well as purely environmental or ecological or climate implications? Then you can perhaps broaden the discourse and point out the things that are being left behind, left out or excluded from the way in which the project is framed. So sustainability is one, but also I think just transition. Now, just transition seems to be an idea that is having increasing interest amongst policymakers and politicians, at least in the global north, and in those countries where there is quite a strong, I guess, coal and economic sectors that are rooted in coal extraction or oil and gas extraction. Policymakers understand that they can't simply switch overnight from that to a low carbon energy or economy. And so the just transition idea, and in particular this discourse of not leaving anyone behind, can provide a means of bringing inclusion into any process of energy infrastructure siting, and to call out any practices which exclude and do not recognize the input of particular groups in ways that I think policymakers will see that they will be vulnerable if they ignore that. So I think there may be potential in that just transition discourse or in the sustainability discourse to question very narrow framings of projects purely in terms of we need to get the technology in place in order to reduce emissions. But of course, I recognize that sustainability inevitably, and also just transition, they are simply rhetorical discourses, that they can also be manipulated and abused. So they have to be paid very careful attention to ensure that there's a kind of genuine action and delivery behind those. It isn't just more empty rhetoric, which is made to sound good and make companies or politicians appear as if they're doing the right thing, but actually to do it fundamentally too.
The next question relates to that. So Matthias Krams posted it in the Zoom chat. So it goes, my impression is that participation is often presented as unanimously positive. As you also indicated in the presentation, shouldn't there be a clearer distinction in the assessment of participation processes between pacifying and co-optive participation processes, like the gas example, and empowering transformative participation processes? And what would be criteria for the distinction?
Right. Well, again, I think I was trying to pick this out in that example. So, you know, what we need if we're playing an academic role, what we need is some detailed evidence gathering and data collection about the actual practices that are happening over time in these case study contexts, and we need the identification and the critique of the, if necessary, in that case. There was clearly an emphasis upon one-way information provision. It was rather shallow. We have frameworks like Arnstein's ladder, which clearly reference tokenistic manipulation of local people, lack of recognition justice. So I think we have theoretical tools and frameworks that we can bring to bear. But what we also need is that in-depth, empirical, data-driven, evidence-driven analyses of what actually happens in these contexts, and then bringing that evidence to bear in an informed way, both to generate the academic literature and knowledge base that we need, but also to provide that substantiated evidence that we can bring to policymakers and say, this is not working, this is inappropriate, as you said, it's simply pacifying and co-opting communities. It is in fact exclusionary and leaving communities behind in a very deliberate way. And I think that if you can bring that evidence to bear in a robust and rigorous way, then you have a strong platform. And if you can communicate it effectively, and this is where my kind of access project I mentioned at the end begins to come into place. If you can develop the communication channels into policy-making structures, if you can do that co-production of evidence and bring that rigorous evidence to bear, then I think you have some potential for encouraging structural change and changing existing narratives and ways of working. That's at least my hope and what we're going to try and do in the UK.
Thank you. We have another one in a few seconds.
Thank you very much. I'm Remy, just a citizen, I may say. I will illustrate my question with a little story, and I would like to have your opinion about that. In a world where there is several energy community, maybe a company that has a monopoly on energy at the national level, and the authority public that want to administrate that, how to and there is the opportunity to make a kind of smart grid of how does the energy is produced, stocked, and exploited. How to harmonize that? What about a third-party body with a shared chairs of concerned actors? Yes, that's all.
Yeah, I'm not sure, maybe I completely understood the question, but I think what you're saying is that in a context where there is a single institution or company that has a very powerful role in the system, are you asking if there's potential to bring some kind of other structure to bear which can have some oversight or some scrutiny, or is that correct?
Sorry. If there is only one company, there is this predatory behavior on, and don't let energy community self-sufficient rise. And so in the future where there is more diverse actors on energy, as you said about energy community that are self-sufficient, that are now mature enough, they are not alone in the landscape, in the energy landscape. There is other actors, and there is challenge that they may share with others, with the other actors, as I said, the public authorities, big companies, and how to harmonize all of their motivation, all of their ambition, all of their needs also, how to acknowledge all that and to avoid predatory behavior from one to others and let energy community disappear.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a pretty big question, I have to say. I mean, I think, in a European context, at least, there is increasing policy recognition of the valuable contribution that citizen energy projects or community energy projects can have in the broader energy transition. So we see the emergence in EU policy, for example, and sometimes in policy in the UK as well, about the value of local energy initiatives and community-driven initiatives. So, okay, that might not be the case in the context where you are, but yeah, I mean, I think, to some extent, there are opportunities from new technology development. One of the characteristics of renewable energy technologies, like solar in particular, is that they can be deployed at much smaller scales than, the oil, coal, gas-fired power stations that were parts of the energy systems in the past, at least in developed countries. So there is the potential for communities simply to try and do bottom-up actions without waiting for anybody's permission to some degree, and just take a kind of an active approach to it and to take the initiative. But I also think that that particular context is obviously very challenging. There is a lot of literature in the transition literature in social science about the role of incumbent industry who will try and block change, who will try and prevent change, who will try and lobby policymakers to ensure that their power in the marketplace is preserved. And all I can say is that, what's needed is to have that, to try and bring influence to bear upon the policymakers, if necessary, by pointing out alternative structures that exist in other countries or other geographical and political contexts, and to point out to the benefits and the value of bringing alternative approaches to bear, like a community energy approach or a sustainable energy approach or a citizen energy approach, and to point out the multiplicity of models that can be brought to bear rather than simply the one large incumbent organization. But clearly that's a very challenging context given the power and the leverage that they will have in that system at the moment. So I don't think I have any easy solutions for you, but I do think that if you look internationally and you try and bring that international experience into that context and communicate it to policymakers, they can see that there are actually many ways to approach this. There isn't just one way, and that in some senses you could say that the necessity to act rapidly and urgently, which is what we need in a climate emergency, it needs all actions to take place, not just waiting on the existing incumbent actors to change. We don't have time for that. There should be pathways which have possibilities for different kinds of organizations, small and large, civil society, private companies, social enterprises. They all have positive roles potentially to play in the rapid, urgent energy transitions that we need to have.
Thank you. Next one.
Hi, my name is Jessica Hogan. I'm a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews. I'm really interested to hear about two kind of things. Firstly, I guess, how do you see kind of these ideas of place and participation in offshore wind energy? Basically, I went to an energy conference in Glasgow a few weeks ago, and a developer said to me, people are preferring to go offshore because they don't have to deal with people. And of course, you know, that's not necessarily true. And so I'm curious about how you see those concepts in offshore as kind of they're pushing for that, especially in Scotland. And so also, can you expand on your experience with your local community wind project? Because you said that you learned a lot from that, and I'd be curious to hear about that as well. Thank you.
Okay, so firstly, to talk about offshore wind and maybe reference Scotland a little bit as well. Well, I mean, if we go back to 2009, 2010, 2011, the work I was doing at that stage with people like Gordon Walker, we were identifying even at that stage that there was a presumption, a widespread presumption in the renewable energy industry networks that the way to solve the NIMBY problem was to put the technology as far away from communities as possible. So let's put it out to sea because no one will care what happens in the ocean. I mean, and we were quite critical of that perspective even at that stage. And other really good energy social scientists like Claire Haggett, for example, from the University of Edinburgh, there's been lots of writings to show that that simplistic assumption that if you put an offshore wind farm out to sea, there's no potential issue around social acceptance or community objections. You know, it's a very problematic assumption. So I think that starting point is highly flawed. And the work I've done, for example, in case studies in North Wales, Liverpool Bay, but also the wealth of work that's been happening on the East Coast of the United States over the last few years with people like David Bidwell and Jeremy Firestone. Again, they're showing that placing large-scale renewable energy facilities in the sea are also often highly problematic, and they also require attention to be paid to these ideas of place and participation that I think recur again and again and again. And you need to think about the meanings associated with the sea, the cultural and emotional significance of the coast and the seascape as much as landscapes. And you also need to get those participatory processes right. And of course, they're more complicated because then we have recreational users of the sea. We have fishers whose livelihood depends upon access to the sea. And so it makes the processes of engagement more complicated, but still very, very important. Yeah, so I hope that gives some idea. But I mean, those kind of assumptions that, you know, it's in the sea, so people don't care. I mean, I would turn that around and say, okay, we're in an energy transition. The people living along the coast, they're people who have to consider, you know, how do we reduce their energy demand? How do we get them to consider the sustainability implications of their lifestyles? What kind of foods do they eat, etc. So if we join all these disparate sustainability energy issues together, you can ask different kinds of questions and you can have different reasons for engaging with people, both on the coast and also people who might use marine or maritime spaces. Yeah, and then very briefly, yeah, my experience with community energy. Well, we could be here for quite a long time, but in some senses, I learned, in some ways, you know, I've done research on community engagement, community acceptance for 20 years now, and I learned that if you want to make a community energy project successful, you know, that knowledge which I was seeking to bring, it's only a very small part of the jigsaw, actually. And it's probably not even the most important part. I mean, it's important, but I learned that to have people with financial expertise, to have people with legal expertise, to have people with engineering, technological expertise is absolutely vital. So if you haven't got volunteers or professionals involved in a local energy initiative or a community energy initiative who have that background in accountancy, in law, in engineering, then, you know, you can do whatever community engagement you want informed by the academic literature, but it won't work. So in a way, it was quite a humble experience in a sense of, I learned a huge amount about, and also about the challenges in making a voluntary organization work in a technology deployment context. You know, you put in solar panels on the roofs of community buildings, something quickly goes wrong. How do you deal with matters of insurance, maintenance? How do you distribute you know, the profit and the proceeds? We developed a community fund, which I was involved in helping to design and distribute. All of those issues arise. So it was a tremendously informative process for me personally, and it certainly made me realize the complexities of developing energy projects in a way that I don't think I ever would have appreciated if I was simply maintaining an academic approach to these and researching them as case studies from afar and doing some surveys and focus groups. You know, I don't think there's any substitute for getting your sleeves rolled up and getting involved, and you develop a much different understanding from that. So I would actually encourage you to do it, and anyone else to get involved and see the world in a different way through that, see the energy transition through a different lens, a different set of experiences.
We'll try to take two more, and then probably the last one on Zoom. So
thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Matthias Schmelzer from the University of Jena. I will be talking about degrowth tomorrow. And I thought this was really fascinating, the focus you put on the importance of the local community, local knowledges, etc. My question revolves around the issue of international solidarity, because you never mentioned this at all, but to my understanding, this is a crucial part of energy, of all the transitions we need, in particular for understanding the urgency. And this relates a bit to the first question is basically, what role do you see for international solidarity in these local energy transition processes? And this is related to the second part. You mentioned that UK needs to decarbonize until 2050, but many people and studies increasingly show that we need to actually decarbonize from a global climate justice perspective much earlier. So maybe 20 years earlier. And this makes a huge difference. And I think it also makes a huge difference for how these local processes could actually work, or whether they could work, or how they need to be scaled up to actually deal with this issue of rapidly scaling, rapidly moving out of fossil fuels, basically within less than a decade. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Well, first on the first question, you know, I mean, you know, you're constrained in what you can say in the limited time period. So I do not want to come across as somebody who has a very localist perspective, who puts a wall around a local place and tries to understand what happens when a case study takes place there, or how an energy project should be constructed. I fully recognize that networks of community initiatives, and the example I would give is Rescoop, the kind of network of renewable energy cooperatives, which exists. It began in Europe, but I think it's global now, is a really good example of how you can create a sense of solidarity between different local initiatives. So I don't think local initiatives need to be inward facing. I think they can be outward facing as well if they have the capacity to do so. And I think that's where social movements come through bridging and connecting up these various different local action groups or local initiatives. So I'm fully aware of that. I guess I'm just emphasizing that the bit of the picture that I have been concerned with and researching myself, but I'm not in any way trying to limit the importance of taking that more national or international perspective and looking at the connections between different local initiatives. And we see that playing out. If you're interested in looking at the way in which objections occur to large-scale infrastructure projects, there's a really good example in the west of Ireland of the Corrib gas project, where it was being proposed by Shell and the local action group, and the local objectors connected with objectors to Shell in Nigeria. And so they developed an international network of objection to this project, which was a very important part of the understanding of that project that was brought to bear by the social scientists who've done the research on that particular case study. So I think the lessons are there in the literature. I just didn't emphasize it as much in my presentation, but I certainly recognize that. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of 2050, in the last slides, that's why I framed it as the decade of action. Yeah, it is not about taking action in 2048 or 2049. It is way too late at that stage. So what do we need to do between now and 2030? And from an energy transition point of view, 7 or 8 years is a very short time frame given the size of the infrastructures and the rapidity of change required. So I do think that's why, if you're an academic, at least you need to think, well, hold on a second, you know, what impact is my research having? You know, how do I ensure that simply I can go beyond producing more journal papers? You know, how can that knowledge be turned into action? Who do I need to engage with to do knowledge co-production? Is it civil society groups? Is it policymakers? Is it businesses? I don't really care, as long as academics get out a bit more and try and do engaged research and try and make sure that they share their findings as widely as possible, because if that doesn't happen, I don't think that the transition will be successful. As we mentioned, there will be problems with the way in which engagement take place or project technologies are deployed. I think we need to bring that social science to bear. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think social science has got something useful to say, but we have to get out there and say it visibly and openly and make it easy for companies or policymakers or civil society organizations to hear what we have to say by communicating it effectively. So I hope everybody can join me in doing that between now and 2030 and not waiting until 2050. I completely agree.
Okay, and the last question from Ljubljana.
Hi, my name is Sophie Bichel. I'm a PhD researcher at Drift. I'm working on mobility justice in transitions, and I was really fascinated by your presentation and this sense of place attachment and how to reframe narratives in local communities for transition and connecting to their identity, I guess, tied up in place. And I was just curious whether, like, which elements of those concepts can we translate to the mobility space, where I'm looking at it from a more mobile ontology, but that's definitely also identity tied up in car ownership, for instance. And I'm working with city governments trying to transform cities into less car-dependent spaces, which also changes public space and the places in which people live, but that also has repercussions or consequences for people's mobility and the way that we use mobility. So I was curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, very briefly, I would just say that, you know, one of my PhD students at the moment is trying to connect up literatures of socio-technical imaginaries, which imagine kind of almost sometimes idealistic futures with new technology deployment, whether they're energy or mobility, with the concept of spatial imaginaries. Which talks about how we understand place transformation and the kind of imaginary futures of places alongside the imaginary futures of certain socio-technical pathways. So I think that there is a lot of scope to do really good, critical, rigorous research, which unpicks the spatial imaginings that underpin the socio-technical imaginings that you might be looking at. So for example, if you look at the kind of discourse or rhetoric around, say, I don't know, switching from one transport mode to another, there will be visual and rhetorical discourse which is mobilized around an imaginary future where people live healthier lives. There's more active travel, you have less obesity, you have less air pollution. You have people interacting in the street a bit more. I mean, all of this might be utopian, but it is something about a vision of the future of a place, of a community, of a neighborhood, which is implicit maybe in arguments for trams or for electric vehicles or whatever that new system might look like. So I think that there are ways of looking at it from a place-based way or from a spatial imaginary way. And I'm really all for using you know, in the research process to look at the use of imagery, the use of infographics, the use of maps, the use of visual artifacts to communicate these kind of idealized socio-technical pathways and futures in a way that then makes them concrete in a particular geographical location. You'll see that, I think, in the way in which these projects are proposed and justified. Of course, whether they are real or whether they ever get delivered in that way, whether they are idealistic or even exclusionary, I think that's the purpose of research, to unpick that. But I think if you can go with the sensitivity to the spatial dimensions of the socio-technical propositions, then you can find that material and you can unearth it and hopefully do useful research which unpacks that particular dimension of the process of transition and change.
Thank you. And the last one that's written in the chat in the Zoom from Lydia Machaka. I appreciate the role of social sciences in unpacking and addressing some of the intangible, invisible values and at time costs of transitioning to low carbon economies in society. I wonder how researchers managed to convince the UK government to recognize this great work and perspective. It is not easy to introduce the idea of behavioral public policy or talk about these values or place when countries prioritize the need to address competing challenges such as poverty. And here any lessons to developing countries to learn. And the second question goes in the direction, what's the best way to improve the processes of mobilizing the acceptability of new and sustainable energy solutions that are just and acceptable to communities?
Oh, blimey.
Short.
How long do we have? I mean, I think
50 seconds.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, let me see, I'm coming back to that first question. It's a really good question. Where did this project come from? It actually came from the Funding Council itself. And I think, you know, reading between the lines, I think they want, it's in their interest to try and ensure that the social science bit of the solution is taken account of and is seen as being important by actors in society. So I think it is way too early for us to be able to judge whether our project has had any positive impact. We've only just started. We may not have any positive impact at all. I hope we do, but you know, I think come back to us in 2 to 3 years. We will be having an international conference sometime in year 3. We don't want to be only a UK project or a UK facing, inward facing project. We do want to develop lessons which can be developed in other countries. For example, how do you do environmental social science that is sustainable, that is to do with inclusion and diversity and equality? Those are things which are important everywhere, not just in the UK. So I hope we can produce useful lessons that can be of interest. And yeah, maybe we can come back in a couple of years' time and just do a bit of a reality check on how well we've done and a kind of a critical reflection on that. And as I said, we will be having a major conference in year 3, so look out for that. And we will also be having calls for research projects within Access. So there will be opportunities to participate and to join networks and to pick up on what we're doing. So I hope everybody feels in a position to join us in that respect and to enable what we can do by coming together on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.